Should we start with fur?
Yeah, let's start with boots with the fur.
Boots with the fur.
Boots with the fur.
Where is our fur coming from? Okay, so fur, that's a big topic. And fake fur versus real fur, what's more sustainable / most popular right now?
That's a great question to throw at me, and it's good to join you ladies here on the Problematic Women podcast.
Welcome, Gabriella.
I love these they're not hardball questions, but these like fun topics. But yeah, as we were talking before going on the air, the New York Times put out a really stunning report that I actually really liked because I'm, like you ladies, I'm skeptical about what the New York Times, posts because they have a history of whitewashing a lot of things like communism. So I don't read them religiously. But when they do good reporting like this instance, and even the Wall Street Journal was picking up about more and more women, fashionistas, even guys too, are wanting to scope out vintage fur. Because scrutiny has been placed on these fake alternatives or faux fur because they contain so-called microplastics. They don't like, funny enough, with a lot of environmentalists, they're like, it's made of fossil fuels. How dare it be made fossil fuels? And they're saying that this is actually not environmentally friendly in terms of the upcycle of fur. It's not something that was freshly harvested in terms of a fur bearer. So a fur bearer, for your listeners, if they don't know, is like an animal that contains fur. I mean, all of them do, but
fur, I see.
But like beavers, minks, bears, yeah. So things that can be trapped and that literally have fur. But that's kind of like simply what it's deconstructed to. So vintage fur, for even people who are like conscious about, animal rights or animal welfare, they're saying that, okay, this is a middle ground where I'm not directly involved in the harvesting of a fur bearer, but I don't like the fake alternatives because it doesn't have that same appearance. Yeah. It's not warm. It's not cozy.
Well, and I'm guessing people will discard the fake furs a lot faster, whereas like obviously a real fur, vintage fur, that's handed down. Like there's one fur coat in my family that my grandmother bought, and like all of the cousins.
Your eyes lit up. You're getting that fur, aren't you?
This coat. Well, so my mom has it, and anyway, there's a lot of jealousy over this one coat. But like that coat will never leave my family because it's a real mink coat, and everyone's like, we're keeping that coat.
I have a family mink coat too, and I just made a reel on Instagram about this, talking about this story. And we've had this fur coat from my late great uncle who was Lithuanian, lived in Montreal. We've had it and it's been preserved really well. And I tested it to be like, like this is cool. And like, why would you want to get rid of something like this? But I was reading in the New York Times article that some vintage fur could go up to like $30,000, if not more, because of the demand driving it. So we're thinking supply and demand. Very, very soon, if this is going to be the trend that takes off.
Down payment on a house, right?
Easily. Well, it depends on, I would say, the type of garment that's vintage, how long it is, what type of fur bearer did it come from? Is it something that's, maybe low totem pole, not as expensive, or something as prized as like bear, fox, mink, something of that nature. And I don't know exactly the specifics, but I know some fur bearers. They haven't told me exactly like what the value of each pelt is. But, coming from, and I could talk more about my family history too, but I'm of Lithuanian heritage, and Eastern Europe, your family couldn't escape, someone working with fur. So my grandmother, my dad's mother, worked in a fur factory. So I've always like had this exposure to fur. It's not like abnormal, to come from that part of the world, to have your family come from there, and to hear about fur being normalized. And it's even normalized in America because we used to have a fur bearer culture until the early 20th century, when all these animal welfare organizations, PETA, Humane Society and the like, emerged and were trying to appeal to people's senses, and then also insert this vegan, vegetarian kind of lifestyle on people, to saying like, how could you engage in this cruelty? And I think partly it was a response to the overhunting of different animals. I'm not saying that was like the best response to it, but the best response came when hunters and conservationists said, okay, we can't overkill things because it's not good for conservation. It's not a good example.
Yeah.
We don't want to engage in wanton waste. So that was like an excessive reactionary response to overharvesting. And I think now we have a balance. But now we have this other extreme where with vintage fur, I think this will even extend beyond vintage fur. People will be curious like, okay, the demand, let's say if it's $30,000, I can't afford a shawl. Where can I get something similar, maybe recently harvested in a legal fashion? So you're going to see people perhaps take up trapping. And trapping, I understand, is a little controversial. It looks very ugly. The tools that are used today are not as barbaric, and it's humane. And if something was wrongly trapped, they have these non-lethal traps where you can easily release it. But if someone is engaged in trapping, it's a very highly regulated process. You have to get the license. Mm-hmm. If you're doing it for commercial purposes, you have to be properly accredited. and you have to go through so many different hoops and jumps to sell it. So nobody can just willy-nilly sell it, and you shouldn't be selling, animal parts, because there are lots of laws that govern against that to discourage a black market, discourage, again, kind of this excessive wanton waste that we saw in the early 20th century or late 19th century, culminate 20th century, and kind of put conservation in a standstill. But we've restored that balance within the last 100 years or so. But I think it'll lead to a greater acceptance of trapping. And I say that because we live here in Washington, D.C. area. How many complaints have you heard about people's pets being killed by coyotes? Have you heard about that?
Yeah.
So there will also be a need not only for the fur, but let's say you don't want your local government wasting hundreds of thousands of dollars to cull. In most states, Maryland and Virginia, you're allowed to hunt coyotes and other predators mostly year-round. In Virginia, I know that's the case.
I had no idea.
I didn't realize that.
So let's say hypothetically, I could be in this position where someone would say, "Hey, can you help me cull coyotes? They're ruining my chickens. If you want to take the carcass, help me cull a lot of them." So I may take up that offer in the future. I wouldn't publicly display it. Like, I like to showcase my harvest, but I know that would be a little controversial. It looks like a dog. But if I get several pelts from it, I don't know about eating the coyote. It's kind of weird. It's like eating a dog.
Yeah. Too close.
Too close. Yeah. But the pelts could be repurposed after you cull it. So I think it could lead to greater acceptance of this practice, which has been unfairly maligned as barbaric. But I think it's okay that people know where things come from. And again, it's not going to lead to an onslaught or decimation of coyotes. It just means a sustainable, manageable amount of
You're
culling.
controlling the amount so that they don't overtake. But
yes,
to your point, I think one of the reasons we're talking about this is the whole mob wife trend has become.
It did emanate from that, yes.
Yeah. People want the real fur or a fur lookalike. And I had no idea how many microplastics were in those fake furs. I thought it was a great alternative. Abercrombie was selling it at the cart, very easy. It was like 80 still, but still, it was way more reasonable than what you're saying. Like a 500, the equivalent coat would be thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
Easily.
So to your, this almost parallel market, new, or not even a parallel market, it's just a whole new market that's opening up with the vintage furs. I love it because, again, fewer microplastics, but also there's a ton of supply. You can go to you could go to one of the cool consignment stores here in DC, but you also could go to an estate sale where one of my friends has found plenty of real fur. If it's well kept, then it'll last forever. You just have to know how to do that. But it'll be so exciting to see that. And it also kind of feeds the left's desire to be a sustainable, not waste, net zero nation. So
it is exciting. It is. But the thing is, they say that having these faux alternatives is to go net zero, to be good for the planet.
It's crazy.
But it's very similar to their kind of climate posturing. They tell you to do these alternatives is much better. And then you find out it's not, because what are you sacrificing in the process?
Right.
Are you preaching virtue signaling on sustainability, but actually living out the opposite? It's very similar to ESG and all these financial asset managers who are saying that we're going to invest in biodiversity. We're going to do this. We're going to buy these carbon credits. But it turns out that carbon crediting system is a lot worse, very similar to this preaching of fake sustainability. So people are going back to kind of conventional practices because they see that it actually is not that harmful, or maybe it was misconstrued all these years, and propaganda from PETA, Humane Society, and the like really fed into this fear by people. And then when you don't have a management system in place, people see this, or they see that, some other kind of parallel adjacent type of sector emerges, but could be worse off for the environment. People are like, maybe I shouldn't have bought into this narrative.
Right. Well, and it's interesting too, because it seems like most of the time the solution to climate change, which we still have all of this, research happening where what exactly are we getting for all of these solutions? A lot of the times they resemble socialism, and they resemble, we're making a sacrifice for the greater good. And what exactly are we getting? Are we getting a lower temperature fluctuation, or what's going on? Because there's just so little science out there, so much little to trust. But I do think this leads perfectly, Virginia, into our next topic.
It does. Before we get there, I do want to officially introduce Gabriella Hoffman. If you haven't noticed already, she's an expert on conservation, and she's an expert on energy for the Independent Women's Forum, great friends of Problematic Women that we are a major fan of. And she's also a board member at the Professional Outdoor Media Association. So all things hunting, fishing, outdoor world, sustainability. We're just a huge, huge fan, Gabriella, of the work that you do.
Likewise, of Problematic Women. I'm a big fan. I remember your predecessor, Kelsey, who worked with me at IW when she launched this, and been following the show from afar. And it's great to come on and talk with like-minded women, but not only about being like-minded. I think even amongst conservatism and conservatives today, like we like to engage in dialogue. We're not always going to agree, but it's so good that we can come to a format like this. So I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, we're so excited. For those who are joining us for the very first time, I'm Virginia.
I'm Kristen.
So we do this every week. We talk about the news. We talk about policy issues. We talk about what is happening in our world, but from the perspective of conservative women, or as we say, problematic women. So if you're joining us on YouTube, on Rumble, thanks for pulling up a chair, grab a cup of tea, join the conversation. If you're listening across podcast platforms, make sure to hit that subscribe button, that like button, so you never miss out on brand new shows that drop on YouTube on Wednesday and across all podcast platforms on Thursday. But Kristen, I cut you off, so take it away.
For sure. So we're talking about energy, and we're talking about how just everything is touched by energy, right?
Correct.
We've got
Totally.
not just the gas in our cars, but also how do we get the groceries to the store with energy? How do we, have our computers powered up, energy, and then just
How does that Amazon order get to your door?
I was going to say, I was going to Abercrombie next, but you hit Amazon. That's fine. But every aspect of life is touched by energy, and it's just so interesting to see what exactly is coming out of this administration in terms of energy. Trump has made the promises of drill, baby, drill. But I think to take a step back here, looking at prices and looking at all of the ways that energy touches prices, I would just love to start with that discussion.
Yeah. Well, I think it's huge because we recognize that there is that direct impact, and things like drilling oil actually affects how much you pay when you go to a Walmart and like buy your toothpaste. Like the trickle down effect is huge. So can you break that down a little bit more for us, Gabriella?
Yeah. So obviously energy is integral to life.
Yeah.
We can't live without it. And this debate over going net zero, do you decarbonize, has been kind of a lightning rod in American politics. And you see increasingly here in this country and even globally that a lot of people are scaling back those net zero commitments because of this greater electricity demand that we're witnessing. We've observed this at my center. I've talked about this in articles and various different podcasts. But because of rising electricity demand from reliable energy sources such as natural gas, nuclear, and even coal. Coal is going to be very integral to this mix. Right now on our electricity, so you have primary and secondary energy usage. So secondary usage would include electricity, and I believe it's the raw type of energy for primary. But for electricity consumption right now, what is largely powering our grid here in the United States and really hard to wean off of, it would primarily be natural gas. It's about 43%. Then you have nuclear, which is about 18 some odd percent. And then coal is about 16.2. So about 78% of our grid is currently powered by those three sources.
Wow. That's huge.
So to move away from that forcibly by government fiat would not only lead to shocks in the grid when you're incorporating kind of this unreliable solar and wind that hasn't been proven and tested. That is very expensive to really shore up to when you're catalyzing or putting these projects to utility scale. And then they don't work for more than 35% of the time for solar and wind, respectively, onshore utility scale projects. And those can't even the biggest net zero proponents have said, because of this AI demand, artificial intelligence demand, I don't think we should just be producing and adding more energy simply just because of AI, but also for other things that demand a lot of electricity. To enjoy a first world living standard, we have to have reliable sources powers. Here in the DC metro area, Virginia, if I'm specifically focusing on the Commonwealth of Virginia, most of our electricity comes from natural gas, about 60%, 30 some odd percent comes from nuclear, then coal, and then a little bit from biofuels and very little from renewables. And most of the East Coast has a very similar energy mix too. So the reason why you're seeing this Trump administration steering away from net zero to this rhetoric and kind of posturing of abundance, reliability, and safety. And I'm a big fan. I really love the gestures and the speech coming out of Secretary Chris Wright. Like, I think he's probably the most exciting, energized, no pun intended, cabinet secretary pick of Trump. I'm so fascinated and excited by what he brings to the table. Actual energy industry experience from the private sector. Yeah. He knows energy markets. He knows innovation. And having someone like that help to steer, along with Secretary Bergen from Interior, to help steer what the energy agenda is, will put us on this path to not only having abundant supply of energy. We did have even under Biden, we did have abundant supply of energy. However, he was straining the strategic petroleum reserve. He was keeping energy in the ground. Europe, who takes a lot of our LNG exports, was complaining that we didn't see as many shipments come. And the cancellation of different projects when in the last year of Biden administration was not helpful either.
Yeah.
But what everyone also has to remember, in addition to having a favorable regulatory environment to unleash energy production, supply and demand also dictates things. So everyone's like, well, the Biden administration had this, unparalleled, wonderful, kind of proliferation of oil and gas production. But that was because of leases grandfathered in from Trump 1.0. That was not because Biden was welcoming oil and gas production. He was forced to do it because he was exhausting different reserves. His clean energy projects from the Inflation Reduction Act and all this government spending was leading to increase in energy or environmental inflation or enflation. And so he had to, revert back to, okay, we have to allow certain conventional energy to continue because these other intermittent sources are not working, even though they were putting all this money, billions of dollars into solar and wind. And interestingly enough, I kind of noticed a pattern where with all this spending going, you saw the collapse of these respective industries. Offshore wind had a horrible 2023.
Yep.
Solar had a terrible 2024. Nobody's talking about it, but one of the major rooftop solars was on the verge of collapse, and they received a lot of government subsidies stemming back even from the Obama era. Wind generation was actually down for the first time in 3 decades, according to the government, the Information Energy Administration, Energy Information Administration, the EIA. And so obviously these are very weather-dependent sources. Solar depends on the sun. Wind depends on the wind. So if they can't, work beyond a fraction of the year, 25, 35%, solar and wind respectively, how can that replace fossil fuels? So I think that's why the Trump administration is really gung-ho about not only drill, baby, drill, but even plug, baby, plug with respect to nuclear. In addition to oil and gas coming back, you are seeing this prioritization of nuclear. Secretary Wright has talked about this. President Trump has mentioned a little, but he kind of conflates it with like nuclear arms. But Secretary Wright has said, no, actually, nuclear energy is something we're going to be prioritizing to help cut China and Russia's competitive edge. Even though we spearheaded the technology in World War II era, we created it, and we have all these plants that are being sunsetted that shouldn't be sunsetted, especially with this growing electricity demand. So growing electricity demand, kind of the takeaway of this, is forcing net zero proponents to say, we need these fossil fuels. We need nuclear. And if we don't have it, we're going to be in a very perilous situation. Electricity prices will go up too.
I think that's interesting that you mentioned nuclear, because when I've had conversations with environmentalists, with climate experts, and I ask them, like, what is the cleanest, truly cleanest form of energy and the form of energy that you would advocate for the most consistently, the response I get is nuclear.
It is.
Which is very fascinating.
Yeah, because it works 93% of the year. And it uses a very small footprint, about 1 square mile of land, compared to solar and wind, which requires, I think solar needs 75 times more land, and wind needs about 360 times more land to meet that same equivalent. I think it's 1 gigawatt of electricity, the equivalent of that, or 1,000 megawatts. Just for that type of requirement. And so when you see like how much land is not really needed for nuclear, that you can even reuse that spent fuel or nuclear fuel that's already been used for smaller reactors, that it works most of the time, that it's very safe, it's very highly regulated. I'm not endorsing, of course, onerous regulations, but nuclear, since it's tied to national security, has so many different guardrails on it.
Interesting.
And there's only been 3 major incidents involving nuclear globally. One here with 3 Mile Island. Thankfully, nobody died. It was, kind of a failure of sense, but they're actually bringing back 3 Mile Island under Constellation Energy. I wouldn't say it was a failure, but it was a mishap. And so because of that mishap, the nuclear energy industry was saying, okay, we need to ensure that, even a little mishap does not thwart our efforts. So that's why nuclear has seen the fewest incidences, even with the coverage of Chernobyl and some of the other accidents that have occurred. In the grand scheme of things, it is one of the safest. It's a very high-paying industry. And it has a lot of potential. And we're playing defense now because for so many decades, due to environmentalists, the onerous environmental review process, not approving new energy infrastructure projects, misinformation about nuclear, we're not having to play catch up. Yeah. So I think the Trump administration has said this has been negatively portrayed. China and Russia are doing it, but they're not doing it the way that we would do it, in an innovative way. We don't want the government to be a major partner in nuclear. We want the market to actually invite nuclear technologies, which is why you're going to see perhaps less of this kind of coziness between the federal government and the nuclear sector. I mean, there are some different ways that they have to work together because, again, it is very, involved with national security. But you now see this interest in the private sector. Investors who were very skeptical of nuclear have said, we need to allow for investments. We want to encourage you to invest in these stocks that are pro-nuclear. So they're pivoting away from solar and wind companies to nuclear after decades of reluctance to do that. So nuclear, if we're talking about the truly cleanest source, it is. But I think it should be decoupled from this net zero jargon, which a lot of people still like to do. And I think, like we've seen with solar and wind, if you couple it onto net zero, it dooms the technology. That's what happened under the Biden administration. Those companies are not profitable. That energy is so intermittent and fleeting. It doesn't last. Yeah. Or they collect that energy and it's wasted, like in California's case. Right. They don't know how to store it.
So what I'm hearing then is nuclear is a very efficient way to also have clean energy. And then that is why it's largely fueling the grid along with our fossil fuels. I like it. I mean, that makes sense to me.
It makes sense. Well, and I think it's this neat shift that we're seeing within the Trump administration of, hey, let's actually talk about kind of the big picture energy, and let's ensure that we are thinking about the future when we're thinking about energy, we're thinking about that production. And then we're seeing these small moves of just like, let's stop being silly about things that don't really matter. Like straws.
Yes.
And you wrote a great piece on this for IWF, for Independent Women's Forum, talking about this shift of, okay, so Trump signed an executive order saying, okay, yeah, we're not going to continue with this banning of plastic straws. I loved it in the executive order. He was like, paper straws that don't work. You just like, it's like, yes, thank you, Mr. President. You're right. We've all had the annoying I feel heard and seen as I'm trying to like drink my smoothie through this paper straw that's melting, literally.
I don't know anyone who approved that policy. Even people on the left were like, this doesn't work.
When did that literally doesn't work?
The guidance went into effect last summer. So it was through executive action. So with Trump repealing or kind of scaling it back through executive action, it's like, my understanding, it's perfectly legal, reasonable take. It first would have applied to the federal workforce. This was not private sector, full economy wide, but had VP Harris possibly won, we would have seen probably an extension or an expansion of that to even apply to the private sector with their net zero dictates like we saw.
And the reasoning, right, for the plastic straw ban.
Well, yeah, it goes all the way back to these Texas A&M researchers. 9 years ago, they were doing research on sea turtles in Costa Rica. Yeah, in Costa Rica. And they came across a turtle that had a straw stuck in its nose, a plastic straw. We have a video of it. They're on this boat and they pull out this turtle and they're like, what's in this turtle's nose? And anyway, it's a little gross, but they pull the straw out of the turtle's nose. Like, you feel bad for the turtle. Like, of course, we don't want a turtle with a straw in its nose. Poor little guy. But, the turtle's fine. But that one video, it has millions of views on YouTube, and it sparked this outcry of now we have to ban all plastic straws because I want to stress, this was one incidence. It wasn't like they found 100 turtles with straws in it. This was one incidence. And because of that, it started this huge outcry to ban plastic straws. And then there was this 9-year-old, what was that little kid's name?
I remember because of a 9-year-old, he was able to wield influence on this policy. I thought we don't trust kids.
Really?
Take our opinions from kids.
Milo Kress. According to the BBC, he was the one that, I don't know how he did it, but he kind of came up with this number that on average across the world, we use 500 million straws a day. Like people use 500 million straws a day. I don't know how he came to that number, but then that number became the number that everyone was throwing around. It was like, we have to go after the plastic straws. When in reality, it's like, sure, if you don't need a straw, don't use a straw. Like, don't be wasteful.
Yeah.
And when you look at how many plastics we use, like the straw percentage is so small.
It's 1%.
Because it's tiny, plastics.
Right. And it's bizarre that they would, again, the previous administration and additionally their environmental backers, they look to go after the low-hanging fruit and say that this is the most egregious thing that's happening, And when you force them to live by the standard, I like to jokingly and playfully throw back at them, okay, you want to decarbonize the economy and the grid. Can you personally divest from fossil fuels? And they get so irked by that. They're like, how dare you suggest
Stop using the plastic straws.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're like, well, okay, so would you apply that standard for your own lifestyle? Yeah. No, because like my impact's not going to change anything. You just proved your point.
Exactly.
And you can be very conscious about discarding things. I think because of just, the examples of turtles and just people are very influenced by perception or damage to the environment. And we're very conscious. We're not the same country we were 50 years ago. Not saying we were totally woefully reckless, but now because of social media scrutiny, better standards, we don't want to be engaging in wanton waste, like seeing pile up of plastics on our beaches and things. It's not the U.S. who's perpetrating this. And I'm not saying that this is to excuse any behavior anyone does here. There are people who litter, and I find that disgusting. I go fishing sometimes even locally and beyond, and I will see trash and litter, and I'm thinking to myself, like, do you not see the signs? Like, why aren't you more personally responsible? It's incumbent on you to do it. And sometimes these people are environmentalists, but they're hypocrites in terms of discarding trash or not picking up trash. But I digress there. But with the straw stuff, it's so minuscule, and so what? You're putting scrutiny on us when other countries are the ones, like you go to Asia, I think even South America, Russia, China, India. Those are the countries, you look at all the different, like, hierarchy and lists of the countries that are most egregious plastic polluters. We're not even in the top 10. Wow. All things considered.
Wow.
Right.
But the Biden administration was like, okay, we're going to ban it across the chain of the federal government. And then I think they would have gone to, say, economy-wide, much like the net zero call to go carbon-free economy-wide by 2050. It's the same logic. It would never have worked. Would it have reduced a fraction of plastic pollution? I doubt that. It was just a way to, I think there would have been
virtue signaling.
It's virtue signaling. And they would have favored companies, let's say they created a sort of incentive to facilitate that net zero plastic waste goal. Were they going to reward people who agree with them, that follow and preach maybe flawed science?
Ooh.
So there's always kickbacks. And I know we'll talk about that more with what this administration's uncovering. But there were so many different kind of questionable tentacles with that, like that you can surmise from that. Like, who's going to benefit from this? Does this actually have a net benefit to the environment? I would argue no. Very similar to net zero. Net zero, you would have had $7 trillion, according to Heritage Foundation, which you guys stemmed out of originally as a publication. But your sister organization, or cousin organization rather, has done great research and found that even if you pursue net zero goals, very similar to if you go net zero on plastics, you'd only reduce global temperatures not by 1.5 degrees Celsius, 0.2 of a degree Celsius. Right. And then $7 trillion of economic destruction and thousands upon thousands of people displaced from the workforce. Could you imagine similar results that would apply there too? If you go by that logic, you can draw that connection in parallel using that same kind of principle. It would have minimal effect, untold economic destruction, and no enrichment to the environment.
And that economic destruction is directly impacting the poorest parts of the world. Like, they are the ones that will suffer most. You push solar, who are the individuals who are going to suffer most? It's those really, really low income, poverty-stricken countries. They're already struggling. We know the best way to pull those countries out of poverty is by things like, more production of fossil fuels and oil, gas, all of that. So really critical.
There's a reason it's called fossil fuels, right? Like, and not renewable energy. It's because we actually need that.
Yeah, exactly.
For the energy. Energy just doesn't come out of nowhere. But
and it's natural.
From the utility scale, if I may add, people who have difficulty drinking, especially for those who might be disabled, the plastic straw is more effective for them to drink.
Sure.
I mean, even if you don't have a disability, but if you're just someone who wants practical function to drink out of, but even from a medical standpoint, those who suffer medical disabilities, the industry has said we need this because these people can't drink or consume liquids without it.
Yeah.
And so why would you want to imperil that population? And then even beyond that, just the regular consumer, it gets wet when you insert it into your drink, and it doesn't work in it. You feel that weird plastic taste. Like, how much of microplastics are you ingesting?
Yeah.
All that type of stuff. I mean, there are steel straws, metallic straws, those kind of have a funny taste.
You knock your teeth on them and you can break them.
Yeah, exactly.
I get freaked out by that all the time. I'm not kidding. That's like my biggest fear is knocking a tooth out with a steel
Well, now
straw.
we have straw choice.
It's not my biggest fear, but
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think the Titanic is your biggest
which
fear.
is a good pivot actually to the next. I think energy fuels life. I'm going to wrap the bow on that. But to your point, you've already kind of brought this up that we are now discovering, through Doge and other great advocates for government efficiency that, I mean, honestly, wait, can we take a second though? And like just Doge has literally uncovered the swamp. I know we joke about that all the time.
But it's true.
But there is so much clear evidence on how this system has been working. And I just think it kind of feeds into the conversation earlier where we're seeing why we're not a more advanced society, why we can't use, or why we can't have nice things. Let's just put it like that. Whether it be straws or, no blackouts in California, reliable energy, it's kind of insane.
Your household appliances.
Yeah, exactly.
Your gas stoves.
Gas stoves, rip. But we're seeing the government uncover this. And recently, the administrator of the EPA, Lee Zeldin, who, if you guys remember, ran for governor in New York. It was a very, very close race considering it was New York.
Yeah.
And actually bar that, even just in general. But what he was finding is a discovery of $20 billion in a slush fund created by the Biden administration as a part of, get this, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is hilarious because I'm laughing, right? Because that was a bill largely passed to improve government efficiency and invest in clean energy. What we're kind of starting to see, though, is maybe some of that wasn't necessarily true.
It wasn't used responsibly?
It wasn't. No, it wasn't. And Lee Zeldin, credit where credit is due for the administrator, he is now really diving in deep. He's starting to freeze funds from the EPA. He's starting to find ways to claw the money back, similar to what we saw with Kristi Noem and just the wasteful spending for illegal immigrants at those hotels. This is essentially the equivalent of that.
Yeah. On the energy front.
On the energy front. And I think the saddest part about this entire situation is 2 months ago, Project Veritas came out with a video, I almost said an article, a video where they were talking to Brent Efron, a special advisor, I think that was the title, a special advisor special advisor for implementation at the EPA, who basically explained how the distribution process went. And I think we just let him speak for himself.
Let him explain.
It truly feels like we're on the Titanic and we're throwing like gold bars off the hatch. Does it really? It's gotta feel weird. It's weird. I mean, it's not good vibes. It's not good. I mean, everyone's very fast. Who are the gold bars going to? Nonprofits, states, tribes, cities.
Anything like in the news that I would know of?
Not yet.
Like any organizations, like
well, they're all local. A lot of them are small, not like local nonprofits. So it's like a big thing that most of the stuff we funded, but the thing that we haven't funded yet are like the local nonprofit program that like was going to be like a winter Kamala Harris administration program. So now we're just like getting it as quick as possible.
right. It's to the tune of $50 billion.
No, it's like $2 billion at this point. But yeah, we've got most of it, like 90% of that. But
All right, so
A lot of money.
lots of money, $50 billion they started with. They have, claimed that they got about 90% out. 90% of that distributed.
Yeah.
And I think the craziest part of this is that they didn't start distributing those funds until August of 2024. So Infrastructure Act comes out in 2022. They get, money that they can award to these organizations, to these towns, to these cities. And now they're starting to distribute between August and November. I mean, let's be honest, January 20th at noon. That's pretty much the time period they had. They distributed mostly to nonprofits, and Efron explains that was largely because then the government can't claw it back. You've awarded it to these nonprofits, then they're going to use it how they feel fit. And some of those projects were clean energy focused, climate justice, environmental justice, all of that. Very discouraging and honestly not surprising.
Well, and it feels like it was a rushed, oh shoot, we have this money, we have to get it out the door, and no consideration was taken for, is this a wise use of taxpayer money that is going to achieve sustainable and productive energy goals for the United States? It was, no, we have this money, we're going to spend it as fast as we can.
Right. And so instead of looking at maybe nuclear and seeing like where else can that, fill in some gaps, instead we're going to send it to use solar power in an urban area where there's a ton of buildings.
EV charging stations.
Yeah. Craziness.
Battery. All this green nonsense. It was to be, not to toot my own horn, but it was something that we had been documenting at the center for quite a while. And if you were following the day one executive orders of Biden, you could predict that this was predictable and this was habitual, all this crazy green spending. And the IRA was the Green New Deal light. They couldn't get a robust Green New Deal. This was Green New Deal light with respect to the IRA. But you looked at the climate posturing. How are they orienting the mission statement of the agencies? They were putting net zero, climate, environmental justice, DEI ahead of the primary functions of, let's say, EPA to ensure clean water, clean air, etc. Same with Department of Interior, which is not supposed to be politicized. Supposed to safeguard public lands, supposed to allow for energy production, mineral extraction, things of that sort, tribal rights. It was even being politicized. I remember covering stories and highlighting this at our center too, that they were putting climate posturing over wildlife management, and they had eco grief sessions. I remember Harriet Hageman. Did you hear about? Do you recall that?
Hear about it.
So how much money was even wasted in agencies that are not supposed to be? So this revelation from Zeldin is very illuminating, but it's not the tip of the spear. There's a lot more.
Right, and he said uncovered. That. In fairness to him, he's like, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yes. So climate, EPA especially, and Department of Energy received the most. They got the most regulations under Biden-Harris, and then you would probably see accompanying funding appropriated for those regulations. So again, who's benefiting from those regulations? The full electricity groups like Rewiring America, who were very gung-ho about banning gas stoves and gas-powered appliances. And then the relating to the $20 billion gold bar stuff, I believe it was 7 to 9 green capital firms getting billions of dollars each. I forget exactly what the distribution was, but these unproven green capital firms, which are tied to Democratic donors, would be on the receiving end of these funds for something that is not provable. Green capital is being debated even in the markets. Again, people are steering away from this net zero investment strategy, ESG strategy, and they're realizing that money is going to be wasted because they're going to be projecting, saying that we're going to be, doing carbon offsets, or we're going to be according ourselves to the sustainability mission. But it's ultimately, and actually, Chuck Grassley, let me step back a little bit, uncovered last year that EPA grants from the American Rescue Plan, if I'm not mistaken, or the bipartisan infrastructure, one of the first early spending bills, he found that for this particular grant program about green sustainability, climate justice, 94% of it went to overhead. It didn't go to actual improvement of the environment.
Right.
So this is going to be a pattern of uncovering.
And credit where credit is due. New York Post, I think, broke the exclusive, and the reporter there she talked about how she started to dig into some of the organizations where this money was going to see, this is a part of the swamp, right? You, when you're in the government, I mean, I would never do this, but when you're in the government, you make deals, you do favors, and then when you get out of the government, you cash out. And so what she started to do is uncover and look into these different organizations that received the funding. She found a lot of positions that were opened just, in January. So it'll be interesting. None of them have staff listed. It's probably intentional, or maybe not. I don't know. I'm not going to assume the worst, but it just continues that ecosystem, if you will, of,
green
you're
climate
in the government. And then you get out, and then you go back in, and you just funnel money. That is the business model. It's not efficient, and Americans deserve better.
Well, and when we think about this kind of sustainability side and improving health for the whole country, like so much of that, like we've been talking about, tied to the environment. But we're also seeing with the MAHA movement, which we're big fans of on the show, we've talked about a lot, that there's a shift also for Americans, like, all right, let's make sure we're making wise choices on like that energy, environmental side for our country. And let's do that personally too. And you are actually, Gabriella, giving a speech at CPAC this week on the dietary guidelines. This is very controversial. We all have that picture in our head. I remember it being on the back or like side of cereal boxes, that food pyramid as a kid, and like looking and being like, oh, it's in the pyramid. I can have at least one ice cream every day.
Keeping Ben and Jerry's in business.
Yeah. And a lot of bread. But it's interesting that now we have, in some ways, I think so many Americans have been surprised that they probably 10 years ago wouldn't have guessed that under a really conservative administration, there would be this huge pushback against the Food and Drug Administration and against what those dietary guidelines are. But that's exactly what we're seeing. So what are the shifts that you're kind of watching? Where are you looking at, okay, I'm hopeful that maybe there will be some significant and sustainable changes to dietary guidelines in the United States within the next 4 years.
Well, we have to be honest. How many people do you know actually follow these guidelines?
No one.
They're really hard to enforce.
No one.
But if people take, I don't want the government to force behaviors, ultimately, even if I agree with a lot of it, but I think it may compel people, or maybe the posturing that we see may compel people to individually look to improve their habits. I know culturally there's a huge emphasis now on people getting into shape, eating, doing this. I've done a lot of walking. I've kept off like 15 pounds since going to Europe, doing lots of walks.
Love it.
And it's for women, it's an excellent exercise. It's not going to activate cortisol. You don't need to be a doctor to do this. But if you have a balanced diet and you're not eating so much in sugar and you're cutting back on sugar, you're not eating so much of carbohydrates and you're kind of scaling up meat and vegetables. And if you want to be even more full-throated about it, you're sourcing the meat yourself, hunting and fishing, or even, buying a cow from a farmer.
Yeah.
If you can't necessarily, not encouraging people to hunt cows, like that's not what we're talking about. But you can, during COVID, this was very interesting that people, because of, and now we're seeing this with the egg shortage too. People were going to farmers they know, family members, friends, neighbors, and saying, I want to buy a half of a cow. What does that entail? Because of shocks to the supply chain. Yeah. Now what we're seeing with this egg shortage, I had talked about this on WMAL last week, that certain localities, Fairfax County, being in particular, wants to make it harder for you to legally own backyard chickens. I could rebel. I could do it under the table. If I had more time, I especially would try to get the engine started here. I had a pet chicken when I was in first grade, a long time ago. So I have some experience handling chickens. But I want to have 6 hens in my county. I'd have to pay, we don't know if it's a one-time fee or a yearly fee, $435. Vince Colonnese and his listeners were astounded that figure exists. And they hid that number from the website, from Fairfax County's Soil and Water Board Conservation, whatever governs that. And then you also have to, for you to have chickens on under 2 acres.
Is it like a property tax, or what are they calling it?
It's not exactly like a property tax. It's a tax.
Chicken tax.
It's just a chicken tax.
I bet you they tie it to like property tax, like because they want to increase property taxes on us because they're mismanaged as a board of supervisors. But like people want to know where their eggs come from. They want to know what type of meat they're eating. And what we had seen had we not had a change in administrations, and I'm going to emphasize this in my talks at CPAC tomorrow, and you can even look to examples like Europe, kind of like where we would be 5 to 10 years if we had not changed course. So there were people, academics in, I believe it was Georgetown and a couple other institutions, and I don't recall the top of my head, but they were saying that we have to accord our guidelines according to emissions, or recommending scaling back meat consumption because animal agriculture is so carbon intensive. It's terrible. You can't support it. So we have to discourage agriculture and then simultaneously discourage the consumption. By weaning the consumption, we can deter and discourage the producers from, producing beef or chicken or livestock or crops or what have you. So they wanted to create guidance which said, this is so ugly. How can you support doing this? You're killing the environment. The cows need to have their genetics restructured so they don't emit so much in flatulence, which if you change the makeup of a cow, I've read, it's really bad not only for the cow, it's also bad for the meat.
Yeah.
The quality of meat, it's highly questionable. Why they would do this, it's beyond me. But these are the same people who say you could change your gender.
They're playing God. I was literally just about to say that. They're playing God, and they don't care if it shortens like the lifespans of humans. They don't care what impact it has on anyone. It's not a free market system. It's made up science that they're pushing and probably getting paid a lot to do so. So
yeah, this board in question, it's like an obscure USDA or HHS board. I think it works with both. I think there's a memorandum of understanding where they're collaborating with health and food. And they even had guidance for reducing meat consumption at the tail end of Biden administration. Again, it had like this kind of climate posturing saying for greenhouse gas accountability, emissions reductions, you have to reassess this. And we have seen similar to these kind of unproven renewable clean energy like solar and wind. We saw a lot of people were hyping up the fake meat movement or fake meat alternatives. So whether it's plant-based burgers or the lab-grown meat, and there's really not a market for either. And actually, a lot of those fake meat companies, the plant-based burgers, have 20-some ingredients. Yeah. You don't know where it comes from. And those companies, even with some like support from the government or some propping up by certain bureaucrats, They were not profitable. They lost huge market shares because the public said, okay, the government is forcing behaviors. They want me to eat this, like through guidance, or even lab-grown meat. UC Davis put out a study a few years ago saying it actually is worse for the environment to create it. So if a source like UC Davis, which is not a paragon of conservatism, is saying, okay, let's pump the brakes here. You know, if you want to create a market for it, great. If it can thrive in the market, absolutely, why not? But even in the market with this pairing of government kind of forcing behaviors, even not through direct policy, but there was even, I think, a USDA rule to allow for the labeling of lab-grown meat as meat.
That's disgusting.
Wow.
It's almost as bad as like them letting, you know, like the stickers of this is what you're eating, and it's like a cow in one of those. Like, I hate that. Don't tell me what to do. Like, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to eat more meat. And I have been.
No. Good job. And again, we were able to stave that off for at least a couple years. And President Trump is likely to appoint people who have nutritional, science experience. They are not going to discourage you from eating, a well-balanced diet, including meat consumption, because had we not reverted course here, I had written also at IWF about Denmark being one of the few to kind of experiment with this plant-based diet recommendation. And this is from the EU. You can find this in Google List, and I'd be happy to send it to your listeners and followers. But they put out guidance to encourage Danish society to implement gradually a plant-based diet to significantly reduce meat in their diet. And I bet you the EU might adopt it, although there is a lot of pushback in the EU coming to, because they don't like to be, especially in Eastern and Central Europe, they know what forceful behaviors are given their experience with socialism. They don't like that either. So you will probably see even EU-wide pushback, because even the farmers had a lot of protests because of fertilizer bans, net zero dictates, which were even more extreme than ours. But even this insistence to eliminate meat or encourage a plant-based diet are not going to be wholly accepted by people in Europe. But this guidance from Denmark was alarming. I was surprised they were so brazen about it. But again, I'm not surprised at the same time. But they are trying to experiment with that. And when you have governments trying to do that, you'll face pushback. Like, it's just natural. Nobody wants to be told, I have to eat this, accept it, no problem. Because what if it's actually, like we talked about with fur and clean energy, what if the trade-offs are worse than the actual conventional practice?
Absolutely.
So people see that. And farmers are still very integral to European society, too much like they are here. So why would we want to displace that? The cows play a very important role, livestock included too, rest of livestock, with regenerative purposes. The cow is grazing, repurposing, making that land functional and productive. What, you put a fake meat lab facility on that? How much are you emitting more in carbon emissions, greenhouse gases, what have you? And then you displace the cow, which is working in concert with nature to make the land better. When you have the presence of cows, you also have the presence of a lot of birds and other like related species, the symbiosis that you kind of witness. I saw this in Florida with one of my Conservation Nation exposés. Like, there's a system in place where everything can work in concert with each other. The ranchers with their livestock coexisting with endangered species and birds and other types of wildlife. So why would you want to disrupt that conservation process that's already working with these bizarre, unenforceable, impractical government dictates, which will do nothing to help the environment ultimately? And then, of course, displace this very important sector from the economy. You don't want to do that. Farmers are natural players in conservation. We remove them from the process. They have no incentive to be conservationists.
We have a game here we're going to play in a second, but you have a whole podcast that talks about this, the District Conservation Podcast. Share a little bit about that podcast.
Sure.
Because if people are loving this conversation, they can get more of this.
Yes, I love talking about, I do monologues where I talk about kind of the intersection of pop culture and policy relating to these issues, and then, reporting on the news that is happening. So lots of moving parts, lots of news breaking in energy and conservation. And it's fun. I've had the podcast for going on 7 years, and we were reintroduced or reconnected because my good friend who produces my Sportswoman Show podcast, this is kind of tangentially related, but I like to highlight women in the outdoors too. And I've featured women on my podcast, a District of Conservation podcast too. But I love the intersection of policy. I love storytelling. And that is, I went into establishing both podcasts because I recognized there was a deficit in serious public policy conversations relating to DOC, even from a conservative perspective. But I'm not always going to be cheerleading everything Republicans do. I would say most time I would be like, okay, this is the Republican viewpoint. I'm articulating that. I may not agree with all facets of it, but this is where the understanding comes about.
That's healthy.
It's healthy. Right. And so, to be objective, but to say like, this is what you misunderstand about conservatives, conservation, energy, what you're not getting beyond the headlines. So we try to use that to demystify. And then I also bring on lawmakers, newsmakers, thought leaders, and others, even outside of politics, but even those in politics. I've talked to a lot of lawmakers, cabinet secretaries to say, okay, why don't you talk about where you stand on conservation, energy, the intersection of both? Like, how is it good? And then with the Sportswoman show, I just really like telling stories because, sometimes women are not, excited to share their story with a guy. And there's nothing wrong with male interviewers. They're great. They love outdoor women. They love conservative women. But sometimes women feel a lot more comfortable talking to others like them who can kind of relate and bring out something in them that maybe a male interviewer would not necessarily bring out in them. A more comfort, I wouldn't say safe space, but an environment where you could feel comfortable sharing your experience. Yes, honesty. Because like guys don't know about certain emotional things that we go through. We're two different types of sexes and all. But it's nice to be able to do both. And I think there's a demand for it. Of course, podcasting, as unfortunately has become a very saturated type of ecosystem. Yes. And so finding ways to make content relevant, using the word key phrases, SEO. I love that challenge. I was so sad to see Chartable go away. That was like the best way to like track your rankings, and I miss that. But I know there's other alternatives. But podcasting, long form content like this venue is so important because if you're missing something from the news cycle or you want to know something very quickly that could be turned over in a timely fashion, a podcast can do that. You could record something and then within a few hours post it, or within an hour, and it gets populated and circulated. But storytelling too, I think a lot of people, and you've seen kind of separate of like energy and conservation. Now it's really funny to see people on the left, we're talking about the wider political discussion. They're like, we're so behind on social media and influencers. I was like, you guys were the ones who first pioneered social media. Now because conservatives have this advantage.
They were like, we wish we had Joe Rogan. And it was like, yeah, you did.
You did, yeah.
You literally pushed him away.
Yeah, well, the left was so great at, social media, influencer marketing, all these different things, competitive, traditional, new media, everything. And they ceded the advantage because people found that they were not trustful arbiters of the truth. So it's a problem that they brought upon themselves. So creators like us in our respective different kinds of venues can say, we offer something unique. It may not be listened to by tens of thousands of people, but there is some value to it. And I hate that anyone wanting to start a podcast, listening or watching our conversation, don't feel like you have to have tens of thousands of followers because quality over quantity still reigns supreme. I think if you have quality people, members of Congress, I've heard that members of Congress and some other really heavyweights listen, and I'm like, that's more important to me than having just like casual listeners who don't listen, don't know what's going on. But podcasting is still very relevant. You can make news. I helped to break a story, and I was able to crack the top 100 Apple charts for wilderness, even with 6 years of existence.
Wow.
When the Biden administration, following the hurricane in North Carolina, Virginia, I talked to this homesteading couple who was told that the Forest Service was going to be closing tracts of one of these big kind of patches of this national forest that borders Carolina, Virginia. And it was laid out in a map showing the closure. So I brought them on. We shared the story far and wide. Delegate Nick Freitas also helped amplify the story. And it just helped to change the policy indirectly. So like the power of a podcast, and I don't want to say I was responsible for that entirely, but I had
you could take some credit for that.
I guess so.
Highlight.
But like something like that no one was covering.
Yep.
Like the fact that it was able to quickly change policy and force the reopenings of places that were not affected by flooding, that were going to be cut off to hunting and fishing. And a lot of people in those rural areas depend on fishing and hunting to get their protein supply. And if you cut that off, you will make them dependent, on government or to have to go to the grocery store, which could be tens of miles away, and going to the forest, buying a license, contributing to the fabric of conservation, and then also sourcing that meat directly, knowing where it comes from, and having an abundant supply of that for your family. You freeze it, you can have it for up to a year. To disrupt that would just create so much imbalance, not only in the ecosystem, but also in just like society. People want to be self-sufficient. And if you create roadblocks to self-sufficiency, you're going to breed distrust, which is why people are welcoming the Trump administration back to have this kind of stakeholder relationship. I know there's a lot of chaos. Everyone's like, national parks are closing. He's going to be shutting down public lands. You look to his first administration, that did not happen.
Yeah.
And if that is to happen, I'll be the first to sound the alarm and say, okay, let's keep multiple use management. Nobody's going to cut off national parks. Nobody wants to see national parks closed. We just want them better managed.
Yep.
Right.
Maintenance backlog. But you're not going to see closures. Nobody's going to do that. But you see a lot of the left responding and saying because of Doge or certain federal freezes, they're saying like even Trump he's going to attack nature. And we saw this before. We have to wait and see. And usually our worst fears are not realized. But we saw a lot of attacks to public lands access under Biden, which deterred self-sufficiency, which made these activities a lot more expensive. They wanted to have like lead phase outs of tackle and bullet, which would price a lot of regular Americans out of these activities. And so it's really funny to say like, oh my gosh, they're cutting off access. I want to see full substantial proof until I can confirm that. But they were quiet when Biden did it, when he was closing down millions of acres to recreational shooting, to hunting opportunities in Alaska. Not a peep. But when it's Trump, in essence, maybe doing it, but there's no verifiable proof, but there's just a lot of like noise and discussion.
A lot of noise.
Unless there's verifiable proof, I'm going to wait and see what's going to happen there. But self-sufficiency is so important. And that's why I always say through podcasting in both DOC and Sportsman Show, conservation, especially DOC, conservation is conservative. And hopefully nobody trademarks that, but I've been using that. A lot of us use it. Nobody needs to trademark it. Hopefully it'll be, for fair use. But we really are natural stewards. Even with our insistence on energy development. And I think you can have both because you should be able to have both. A lot of people who work in energy also like to go hunting and fishing. And I feel like I could help glue those principles together. And I'm not the only one who does that. But we environmentalists are so narrow-minded in terms of thinking in gray or black and white and not gray, shades of gray, and that the people who work in resource development also care deeply about their surroundings. If they don't have a job, they're less incentivized to care. And why do you have to pit those two interests against one another? So that's why I'm so excited by the Biden administration, Biden administration. What am I talking about? The Trump administration, excuse me. The Trump administration prioritizing this balance, this restoring of balance between energy development, conservation, making sure everyone's interests are represented, everyone has a seat at the table. Because Biden did a terrible, shoddy job of alienating huge stakeholders out west, creating distrust and a lot of upheaval. And now I think anyone who may have been, temporarily frozen or who didn't take a voluntary buyout, there will be some people who will be brought back into the National Park Service, BLM, because, through some of these like very, wide sweeping cuts, mistakes will happen. Even Elon Musk said, we may not get everything perfectly. So those who are a little bit nervous working in these kind of land agencies, Forest Service, I hopefully want to reassure you that if you were mistakenly let go, most of them will likely come back because they're viewed as essential. Not kind of the low-hanging fruit, the political obstructionists, but there may have been some people who were cut unnecessarily, likely will come back, and we'll see the kinks worked out. They had to bring back a couple nuclear experts because they mistakenly cut them.
Yeah,
so
don't do that.
We have to trust the process. It's not going to be perfect, but it is an exciting time where we see this balance, and we're going to be leading on these conversations, and hopefully our friends in Europe and other countries will say, okay, we should strive to be energy independent, but not, despoil the environment too.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's critical. I love that expression, restoring of balance, because I think that's exactly what we're seeing. So again, for anyone listening, check out the Sportsman podcast and also check out District Conservation podcast. Kristen, over to you. We have a little game here.
Yes,
we're going to end on a lighter note,
lighter note.
Lighter.
So, all right. We started the idea of who wants to be a billionaire because we were joking around about how, politicians who wants to be a billionaire.
Well, because we have all these politicians that
out.
complain about everybody being rich. And I'm like,
yeah, how much are you making?
How much are you making?
How are you benefiting off the taxpayer? Anywho, jokes aside, I have rebranded this game to The Price is Right because,
okay, here we
The
go.
Price is Right.
The Price is Right.
Now, what we're doing, we've got a few rounds. We're going to be guessing which politician makes the most. If you can guess their net worth.
Bonus point.
Yeah,
gosh.
Right, Price is Right rule. So lower person wins.
Okay.
I know we joked about politicians being bought out. I want to just reiterate that was a joke. A lot of these politicians that I have here have been successful in other careers in the past, and that's what I love about politicians is they're a very diverse group of people. So I am not saying that this is not saying that
we're
they
not
are
saying
bought
that they're
out.
bought out. They
And you will understand why soon.
They've worked very, very hard to get where they are.
Exactly. All right. So round one, we're going to start with Congress. So anyone on the Hill, it's going to be senators and representatives. So we're starting with Senator Senator Joe Manchin.
Okay.
We've got Senator Marsha Blackburn, and then Representative AOC. Let's start with guess for who makes the most, and then
Manchin.
guess the net worth.
I'm going to say Manchin.
Well, yeah, since he retired, he probably has the highest net worth. But I
Yeah.
do know who is one of the highest net worths in the Senate now in his replacement.
Yeah. So we're saying Manchin?
That's my vote.
All right.
Are we both agreeing? Are Gabriella?
I think, the retired Senator
net
Manchin.
worth.
Yeah, I would say his net worth was pretty high.
Okay, well, so according to the internet, Senator Marsha Blackburn, she actually owned a marketing firm. Yeah, we might have to fact check it a little bit. But
Yeah, she did. I've interviewed her about that. Yeah.
So she owned them, and I think that largely has to do with it. That's where my little warning label comes in.
It makes sense. I mean, marketing is a huge industry.
Exactly. If we had to guess how much do we think she's worth? It's in maybe the millions, maybe the billions. Who knows?
Oh, I'll say 15 million.
15 million? Okay.
I would probably say 25.
You're closer. It's 41 million.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
From
she
marketing?
was marketing. And I think
right.
she's in Tennessee. There's probably music making, stuff like that. It was like marketing for music and entertainment and all of that. So there's
She's a businesswoman.
Yeah.
Businesswoman. We love to see it.
All right.
She's a great
Marsha
voice for
Blackburn.
conservatism. All right. Second round, governors. All right. So we've got Governor Gavin Newsom. Obviously had to bring him in.
Getty money.
Governor Tim Walz. And then Governor J.B. Pritzker.
Ooh. That would be J.B. Pritzker. He's Hyatt.
Yeah. I would
Hyatt
say
Dynasty.
Pritzker.
All right. Okay. That was obvious. Illinois doesn't really get brought up on the show very much because it's Illinois.
Except by you.
Except by me. So how much do we think he's worth?
Oh.
I think between $150 $200 million.
Okay.
His net worth is pretty high.
It is, yeah.
But I may have inflated it.
Okay. I will say 113 million.
All right. I think you win that one again because he's
wow.
actually $3.5 billion.
Wait, that's right. Shoot, I
Yeah.
undercounted.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yes.
He's a billionaire.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right,
he is.
Because I
Wow.
mean, first of all, he's got the Hyatt, family.
Yes.
Although some people have said that he doesn't benefit from that.
He had to have divested to become an
sure.
elected official. So
But I think technically he's still with that
If
aside.
that's your fan, I mean, even if it's just in the
It's kind of like the
connections,
McDonald's story.
Inheritance and all of that, yeah.
connections,
Well, so he didn't start Hyatt, but his family improved it, much like the McDonald's story.
Yeah, the founder.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I'm actually watching that again.
It's a good
'cause
movie.
It's so
Yeah.
good.
I have not seen it. I'll watch
All right, this is like freestyle round. Okay,
Okay,
so
here we go.
we've got Senator Mark Warner from Virginia.
Yep.
Hopefully he's not, a billionaire because what? Then we've got Secretary Noem, DHS.
Okay.
And finally, I kind of gave you a layup. Representative Nancy Pelosi.
Oh, it's Pelosi.
Yeah.
I thought Warner had more money than Pelosi.
It's very close, actually. I don't know why I gave that away. Yeah. It's very close.
Because he made a lot in tech
yeah.
and business. So maybe because she has stocks a little bit more than him, and he
An
may
app
trade.
that's based off of how she
Yeah.
trades.
Yeah.
And she's been around a long time.
Yeah.
Has been around. It'd be interesting. Okay, so then what do we think Nancy Pelosi's net worth is?
50 million?
300. No, probably 300, 400 million.
So Virginia wins, but that's because it's 250 million.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
That's more than I would have thought.
It is. It's $250 million.
Yeah.
Definitely want to look into that. I think that the better question before we go into our last little segment on this, the better question would have been how much is your worth before versus after? Because to your point,
yeah.
Mark Warner was a tech guy.
Yeah, he brought a lot of money into his
Same
before
with JB.
Congress. Yeah.
So it would be interesting to see that. Maybe that's something we do in the future. How much
Yeah.
did they make? We could truly
and
play.
for
Who Wants to
better
Be a
or worse,
Billionaire.
like the field of politics, it takes a lot of money to get into.
Yes.
now.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, you have to be wealthy.
You really have to be
And there's
wealthy.
nothing, we shouldn't admonish wealth. I
No.
think if you made your wealth earnestly and honestly, of course, Governor Youngkin is worth $500 million. He's the most humble person. You would never expect him to have made so much money from his time in Carlisle. But it was very amiable. He came from humble beginnings and did it, and you would not even realize that he's worth.
JD Vance. We got our VP as well, who's probably
yeah. Well, because he had a best-selling book.
He had a best-selling book, all of that. No, and I think, it's just, you never know where that wealth came from. Hopefully it was honest work, but you never know.
Through the markets.
Last thing I wanted to highlight, this is not necessary, we'll have this, we'll guess. In 2022 dollars, we're going to go for the highest net worth of a president, okay? So the three presidents that we are going off of are obviously the Don, 45-47, Donald J. Trump, George Washington, JFK. Who do we
Okay.
think
Oh,
is
so,
worth
like,
the most?
if you
were to put it
translated-
into 2022 dollars.
Oh, my.
Interesting. I mean, I'm still going to say Trump because I just
Yeah, I think Trump is worth billions of dollars. And JFK, I mean, his family is bootleggers, so maybe money before, handed down. I'm not sure what that translates to in 2022 dollars.
Yeah.
And then George Washington, I don't think he was really wealthy. He was pretty humble. But if you include like Mount Vernon,
There we go. That's
Maybe
smart.
if you sold all the resources that were
yeah.
We're going net worth, so it's like all of the stuff that has value.
everything. Yeah. Okay.
I still would probably lean on Trump unless I'm
because of his real
mistaken.
estate assets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ding, ding, ding. All right. When that was a huge piece of all of these people who have a net worth that is significantly high, it has a lot to do with their real estate
real
assets.
estate.
Yes.
Just so everyone knows, because I know you're all curious, $5.7 billion for Donald Trump.
Okay.
Yeah.
In his net worth, $1.3 billion for JFK.
Really? Wow.
Number 2, and then $525 million in 2022 dollars for George Washington, largely due to Mount Vernon, agriculture, all of that. So,
Fascinating.
in case you were wondering,
That is
those are
these
the
successful
answers.
presidents.
very unique.
Yeah.
well done.
Yeah.
Well,
You learn something new
Gabriella,
every day.
thank you. We have loved having you. We're gonna have
It's a
you back.
pleasure. Thank you. I would love to come back.
And good luck at CPAC this week.
Thank you.
It's an honor to get to speak on that
I
main
forgot
stage.
about that major news thing coming down the road.
No, this is a lot of fun. Let's do it again. Thank you for the
Absolutely.
opportunity.
Thanks, guys. Have a great rest of your week.